Hello, I am Professor Zaldivar, and this is a brief discussion of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Simone de Beauvoir was an existentialist philosopher and a contemporary of Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. And along with Sartre and Camus and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, Simone de Beauvoir is one of our most important existentialist philosophers. As all existentialist philosophers, Beauvoir was very much interested in the question of individual agency and responsibility, as opposed to responsibility that comes from social construct or socially constructed norms. And we see this focus on agency threaded as a contextual element, as a background element to her discussion of feminism and women's issues. In fact, we'll actually see her leaning on agency toward the end when we consider her suggestions as to how to deal with sexist or gender discrimination issues. She begins her discussion by doing a little bit of background discussion on something called conceptualism and on something called nominalism. Conceptualism, roughly speaking, as she discusses it, is the idea that there is an essential nature to things, that women or men or rocks or animals for that matter, everything in the world is the way it is because of some inner nature that it has. And as Beauvoir points out, at the time that she was writing The Second Sex, and still today, metaphysicians have this metaphysical theory has fallen by the wayside, and we no longer really think of essential natures as being the driving force of diversity, or the reason for why things are the way they are. Another view of what it means to be a woman, for example, is this view nominalism. And here, roughly speaking, the idea of nominalism is that the names of things or the categories that things fall into aren't really meaningful descriptors of the way things are. So we have this view which she attributes to women in America, for example, in her day, saying that men and women are essentially the same. There are no differences, no meaningful differences between men and women, and the fact that one half of humanity is called man and the other half of humanity is called woman is just a sort of historical accident or the result of convenience, but does not convey the difference in name does not impart or convey a significant difference of the things that are called. Beauvoir does not like this approach very much. In fact, she says it is not enough to say that women are merely human beings just like men who happen to be arbitrarily designated by the word woman. She thinks that we ought to acknowledge that men and women are indeed different. In fact, biologically different. The biological difference is obvious, but she says that from her perspective, it seems clear that men and women experience the world in a different way, that women have a different view of the world and perhaps a different role in the world, and that failing to acknowledge this difference is a bad thing. So rather than pretend that men and women are exactly the same or almost identical, that we ought to acknowledge that they're different and then consider how to respond. One of the things that she thinks it's very important to acknowledge and that is a central element in thinking about gender issues in general is this idea of the other as opposed to the one. So according to Beauvoir's conception, men are the one, the primary thing, the more important thing, the default thing. The default way to be is the masculine way to be. And women are the other, the exception, the secondary thing, the dependent thing. Some really key concepts to help us understand what it means to be the other is to conclude that, for example, the other is a thing that is not defined on its own terms. It's defined as in relation to the one. So we first have to know what the one is, and then we can think about what the other is. We cannot think about the other without first thinking about the one. Another element is to conclude that the other depends on something else for its existence. The other depends on the one. Women depend on men. Finally, by thinking of women as the other, we think of it gets us to think of women as the thing which isn't rather than the thing which is. In other words, we first think of the thing that is, the man, the default, and then we think about what it isn't, and that's how we come up with the conception of woman. We start off with the conception of man, and then we subtract certain things, and that's how we get the conception of woman. And again, we have this view of woman as being secondary, dependent, derived from our view of men. Now, of course, Simone De Beauvoir is going to be very much against this conception of women, is going to be very much against the idea that women are lesser and secondary to men. And she points out that, first of all, again, acknowledging the difference between men and women, or the very real differences between men and women, does not require conceding that women are less than men. In fact, she will argue that there is no good reason to think of women as the other. That it could have been, as a matter of historical development, that women were the default and men were the derivative other. Now, because of the way history worked out, it turned out that women are conceptualized as the other. But again, and the most important thing, I'll just repeat this, there's no good reason for this. The idea that women are derivative or dependent on men is a fiction that happens to have come about via politics and jostling for power, but it is not an essential truth of women and men. Women and men are equally good, even though they are different. In fact, we could, in a truly enlightened society, we would have no use of the concept of the one and the other. We would all be the one, or perhaps we would all be different ones. Another way of thinking about the relationship between men and women and the historical differences or the conceptual differences that lead to sexist and gender discrimination is this idea of subject and object. And of course, the idea here is that men act as subjects and women traditionally act as objects. And what is the difference between a subject and object? What does it mean to be a subject? What does it mean to be object? Well, more or less, we can get at what she's talking about by thinking of the following sorts of ideas, right? A subject acts, takes actions. An object is acted upon, is inert, is passive. Subjects are active, objects are passive. A subject has preferences, it has agency. Their desires are automatically valid. We understand them as things with preferences and goals that act in order to satisfy those preferences and goals. An object has no preferences, has no goals, does not act on its own. It is, again, the thing that is used by subjects. It is a thing which plays a role in satisfying the preferences and the goals of subjects. It is not allowed to have its own preferences and goals. Which is all to say, an object has autonomy. An object has agency. It has control over itself. A subject has autonomy and agency and control over itself. An object has none of that. An object has no autonomy. An object has no control over itself. An object plays a role in the life of a subject. A subject gets to have a life. This is a really important conceptual tool. This is a really powerful way of thinking about the traditional gender discriminatory sexist relationship between men and women. And if we look at our pop culture, if we look at our, especially traditional pop culture and traditional social narratives, we very often see men as being the important drivers of motions, of plots, of action, and women sort of just being brought along for the ride. That's very much an example of subject versus object thinking. And of course, Simone de Beauvoir is going to be very clear that this is a bad way to view things, right? Every individual ought to be a subject. Every individual ought to have agency. Every individual ought to have their preferences and goals taken as valid. That's really important. It is not that women should be subjects and men should be objects. It is not that women and men should be simultaneously subject and objects for each other. It is that all of us ought to be subjects and that there ought to be no objects. All of us ought to have autonomy. All of us ought to have valid goals and be able to pursue them. Finally, Simone de Beauvoir suggests that an appropriate way to think about this, and the previous discussion about subject and objects hinted at her idea, a feminist is not someone who thinks that women are better than men. A feminist is not someone who thinks that men are inherently bad. A feminist is not someone who thinks that women and men are identical or even necessarily entirely equal. A feminist thinks that women and men are that in fact society ought to be structured in such a way that your gender is not by itself a good reason to keep you from doing something. That's really the bottom line of feminism, right? That gender ought not to be a disqualifying characteristic for any particular job or particular role within society. Simone de Beauvoir expresses this by saying that when we're thinking about just action, when we're thinking about good laws and good policies, the only public good is that which ensures the private good of the citizens. In other words, only policies that enforce concrete opportunities that allow citizens as individuals, regardless of their gender, race, ethnicity, etc., to act in ways that they see fit. Only policies and laws that allow us to act as we see fit as individuals, only those laws can be good. Only those laws are just. It is only in a society in which every person is allowed to be an autonomous agent. Every person is allowed to decide what is good for themselves, and then given the space to act on those beliefs. Only that society can be considered a good society. Only that society can be considered a feminist society. This brings us to the end of our brief discussion of Simone de Beauvoir's introduction to her work, The Second Sex. Thank you very much for listening.